Two sisters on vacation to a paradise-like Hawaiian island. At least that's what other tourists might think, but they'd be wrong. This journey was closer to hell than heaven. The sisters arrived at the luxurious resort with one purpose: to uncover the mystery of what happened to their mother. They were prepared to search for answers alone, but received help from an unexpected source, beyond the grave. Their mother had hidden a clue for them in an envelope with the mundane label, childhood photos. Even when the odds seem stacked against them, the sisters won't stop until they achieve justice. A promise-turned-obsession keeps them steadfast on their path. At the center of this story is Shirlene VanGundy. Once crowned a beauty queen in her native Colorado, Shirlene was a truly stunning, charming, and fascinating woman, and an unconventional mother. Her daughters, Tammy and Tiffany, adored her. Shirlene acted more like their friend than a strict parent. As Tammy recalls, Shirlene often struggled to take care of herself, let alone anyone else. This may be why Tammy had to take on increasing responsibility for her younger sister and grow up faster than most. Shirlene was also, to put it mildly, emotionally unstable. Her mood swings were sudden and dramatic, and any discussion about them was strictly off limits. Breaking this unspoken rule inevitably led to arguments, as Shirlene refused to acknowledge she had any issues. After Shirlene separated from the girl's father, Tammy made the difficult decision not to go with her. Though she loved her mother deeply, she couldn't bring herself to leave her father behind. For years, the sisters lived apart until their father eventually gained custody of Tiffany as well. From then on, the girls loved and worried about their mother, but always from a distance. Then in the late 1980s, Shirlene told her daughters that she had finally found true happiness after meeting a man named Ken Wakisaka. He accepted and loved her just as she was, with all her quirks and mood swings. The two got married. Because Shirlene had always dreamed of living in Hawaii, Ken accepted a job offer on the islands and moved her to a spacious apartment in a great neighborhood. Of course, Shirlene's daughters met Ken, a chivalrous man who carried himself like a true gentleman. He made a good impression right away, and their mother seemed genuinely happy by his side. 10 years passed, the sisters grew up and started families of their own. Tammy settled in California while Tiffany moved to Arizona. That was how things stood at the beginning of 1998. However, Tammy and Tiffany began to realize that not everything was as smooth as it seemed when Shirlene admitted that she and Ken had been fighting. In mid-1999, the sisters managed to visit their mother to see for themselves what was happening. During that trip, Shirlene made an unusual request. She asked her daughters to promise that if anything ever happened to her, they would investigate what had occurred. Naturally, Tiffany and Tammy were surprised and asked, "Mom, what are you talking about? What do you mean if something happens?" Shirlene didn't elaborate but insisted they give her their word. Not long after that, Shirlene split from Ken. The sisters assumed it was a permanent separation and felt relieved. They were happy to see their mother spending time with them and her grandchildren. But then she vanished. For a week, they didn't hear anything from her until she finally reached out, saying she was back in Hawaii, back with Ken, and that everything was fine. She asked them not to worry. But the sisters had every reason to be concerned. Their mother's behavior became increasingly strange. Shirlene would call Tammy, talk about various things, and then call back an hour later, not remembering anything they had just discussed. This deeply upset Tammy, leaving her unsure of what to think. It got to the point where she often ignored her mother's calls. Naturally, she had no idea what was about to happen. On April 4th, 2000, Shirlene tried calling Tammy once again, but Tammy didn't answer the calls. Instead, Shirlene left several voicemail messages. There was nothing unusual about them. She told Tammy that she loved her, that she had found God, and that everything was fine. Tammy decided to wait until morning to call her mother back. When she finally did, it was Ken who picked up the phone. His words were blunt. "I don't know what's wrong with your mother. Talk to her." Tammy asked Shirlene what was happening, but her mother only replied, "I love you." Her words, however, were slurred and muffled, something Shirlene had never done before. Panicking, Tammy called her sister Tiffany and then immediately contacted Honolulu's emergency services, pleading with them to send an ambulance to her mother's house. At the same time, Tiffany managed to get through to Shirlene and was speaking with her on the phone when she heard the sound of an ambulance siren in the background. Tiffany felt a wave of relief, confident that her older sister, as usual, had everything under control. She was sure the paramedics would save their mother. However, the paramedics couldn't determine who needed help. In their report, they later noted that the 52-year-old patient was conscious and appeared calm, though her emotional and mental state raised concerns. She seemed unaware of the paramedics' presence. Her husband, Ken, told the medics that his wife had said to him, "I'm dying," He speculated that she might have taken sleeping pills along with a couple of bottles of beer. But the medics didn't find any empty bottles nearby, and there was no smell of alcohol on Shirlene herself. Based on their assessment, they concluded she wasn't under the influence of alcohol or any substances. As a result, the paramedics decided not to take Shirlene to the hospital and left her at home with her husband. Shirlene managed to speak to her younger daughter one more time, but every word she said was labored and difficult. Later that same day, at 2 p.m., Ken called the paramedics again. This time, they transported Shirlene to the hospital and admitted her to the intensive care unit. The doctors did everything they could, but their efforts were in vain. Ken informed Tammy that Shirlene was in a coma, barely clinging to life. Tammy immediately called Tiffany, and the sisters each rushed to the airport in their respective cities, heading straight to Hawaii. They didn't yet realize that the 6-hour flight would only be the beginning of a long and arduous journey toward justice, and how difficult it would be to fulfill the promise they'd made to their mother. At that moment, Tiffany and Tammy only knew one thing. Their mother was on life support, but they didn't yet understand why or what had happened to her. However, even this was enough for the sisters to call the Honolulu Police Department with their suspicions before they even boarded the plane. Naturally, all their concerns revolved around Ken. After landing, Tiffany called the hospital to check on their mother's condition. A hospital staff member informed her that there was no change in Shirlene's state and that Ken had gone home to feed the dogs. Tiffany couldn't believe it. She felt Ken had no right to leave Shirlene alone. When Detective Wayne Cambra, assigned to investigate the case, arrived at the hospital, he also found Ken's behavior suspicious. He wondered if Ken had gone home to clean up a crime scene. Doctors informed the detective that Shirlene had ingested a large dose of pills, and since treatment wasn't administered in time, she had fallen into a coma. Out of caution, Detective Cambra checked whether Ken had any prior run-ins with the law. It turned out that he had been arrested before for assault. During the flight, Tiffany and Tammy had plenty of time to reflect on what Shirlene had told them 9 months earlier, when they promised to uncover the truth if anything ever happened to her. They didn't yet know what to look for, but they were certain they would find evidence in Ken and Shirlene's apartment. When they arrived, they told Ken they were exhausted from the long journey and asked if they could rest at his apartment. Of course, he handed over the keys and stayed by his wife's side at the hospital. He also gave them a sealed envelope, which they set aside on the back seat of their car for the time being. They were in a rush. The sisters searched the apartment and the surrounding property thoroughly. The doctors believed Shirlene's condition was due to a drug overdose, but Tiffany and Tammy were convinced that their mother hadn't taken the pills willingly. Determined to find evidence, they combed through the house and the yard. It was in the backyard, under a bush, that they discovered packaging from a medication. In their minds, there was only one person who could have hidden it there: Ken Wakisaka. As Tammy and Tiffany were about to get into the car, they remembered another piece of advice their mother had given them. Shirlene had told Tiffany that if anything happened to her, the sisters should ask Ken to give them their childhood photos. Then it hit them: that sealed envelope Ken had handed over. It was labeled childhood pictures, but what they found inside was something entirely different. The envelope contained notes written by Ken. It appeared to be an assignment from an anger management class, a kind of journal listing all the ways he had mistreated Shirlene. "I spat on Shirlene. I yelled at Shirlene. I pushed Shirlene," the notes read, all written in Ken's handwriting. This was the evidence Shirlene had left behind for her daughters. Suddenly, they realized that their mother had been leaving them clues, practically screaming from beyond the grave that she had been the victim of a crime. With the detectives' support, they developed a plan to secretly record a phone conversation with Ken. Tammy called him from the police station, acting friendly and attempting to get him to open up. Ken confessed to Tammy that he was very worried about Shirlene, expressing how much he loved her and how lonely he felt without her. He and Tammy discussed the day in detail. Shirlene had told him she had taken the pills, and she had acted as if she were already saying goodbye to life, but nothing seemed to work. She kept repeating, "The pills aren't working, the pills aren't working." Then, hesitating, Ken admitted that Shirlene had asked him to strangle her, but of course, he hadn't done it. Tammy asked if he had considered calling emergency services, but he thought she was just depressed and didn't know what to think. During the conversation, Ken also directly told Tammy that the sisters' behavior seemed suspicious to him. He thought they might try to accuse him of either involuntary manslaughter or murder. He repeatedly assured her that he hadn't harmed his wife, that he hadn't strangled her, and that doctors could check for signs of strangulation. Tammy and Tiffany believed they needed to act quickly. They felt that as long as their mother was alive, they had the right to search Ken and Shirlene's house and garage in California. However, when they left the island, Ken allowed the doctors to disconnect Shirlene from life support, and she passed away. Detective Wayne Cambra attended the funeral, and in his opinion, Ken's eulogy sounded more like a rehearsed defense speech for a trial. While it's true that not everyone is good at delivering speeches, the various details added up and further convinced the sisters that they had to fulfill their promise to their mother. They were determined to make sure Ken would be held accountable and sent to prison for her murder. The prosecutor took over the case and immediately became intrigued by Ken's mention of strangulation, especially since he had brought it up twice. Ken had mentioned this to the coroner as well, allegedly trying to convince him not to perform an autopsy, insisting that his wife had died of natural causes. However, the autopsy was conducted, and the pathologist concluded that Shirlene had died from brain damage caused by strangulation. Up until that point, Shirlene's death had been considered a drug overdose by everyone involved: the police, the hospital staff, and even her daughters, Tiffany and Tammy. Ken was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. In 2002, 2 years after Shirlene's death, her husband stood trial. The prosecution presented a series of key pieces of evidence. First and foremost, the coroner's conclusion about the cause of her death. Additionally, there was the secretly recorded conversation between Tammy and Ken, his recorded admissions of domestic violence, and the testimony of the sisters. The prosecution also revealed that during his separation from Shirlene, Ken had taken out a $150,000 life insurance policy on her, which, according to the prosecution, he later used to convince her to reconcile and return to him. Ken's defense attorney tried to argue that the police had rushed to conclusions and that this was not a murder. The defense even brought forward a coroner who admitted that Shirlene could have died from a heart attack rather than brain damage caused by strangulation. Ken never took the witness stand. Finally, after 2 weeks of court proceedings, Tiffany and Tammy heard the verdict. They were overjoyed when 46-year-old Ken was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. This could have been the end of the story, but an astonishing encounter, an interesting coincidence, would change everything. Attorney John Edmonds visited his client, the convicted murderer, in prison. The inmate told the lawyer that Ken didn't belong there and that there were many oddities and inconsistencies in his case. He asked Edmonds to meet with Ken. Edmonds wasn't used to seeking clients in prison, but he was intrigued by the man's words. He reviewed the trial materials and discovered a critical mistake made by the prosecutor. In his closing remarks, the prosecutor had directly accused the defendant of failing to take the witness stand. The prosecutor stated, "If the defendant does not tell us what happened that day, then all we can do is judge by what the body of Shirlene tells us." This was a gross error. The Fifth Amendment privilege is the right not to testify against oneself. It's a constitutional right, and the prosecutor cannot even comment on it. However, Ken's attorney didn't raise an objection, and the judge didn't address it either. The prosecutor later claimed that he misspoke and intended to say, "if he doesn't know," rather than "if he doesn't tell us," but it was a significant slip. This mistake became the foundation for an appeal that John Edmonds filed. By that time, Tiffany and Tammy had long forgotten about Ken. They believed the case was closed and assumed that all prisoners filed appeals, but that they were usually of little consequence. However, this appeal would turn out to be different. In 2003, 1 year after Ken was convicted, the Supreme Court overturned the verdict. However, this did not mean that Ken was declared innocent. He was released on bail, but the charges against him were not dropped, and a retrial could start at any time. Once again, his lawyer, John Edmonds, turned to the case files and began to study them carefully. What he found shocked him. He discovered a huge oversight by the prosecution that had occurred even before the trial. In the Wakisaka couple's apartment, there was a young man living there who was not related to them. He was simply renting a room. The grand jury, before the trial had even begun, had requested that this young man be called as a witness. Normally, when a grand jury asks for a witness to be called, the prosecutor is obligated to comply. However, the prosecutor failed to call the witness, even though his importance to the case was undeniable, as he could have known more about what happened to Shirlene. On the fateful morning of her death, the young man had been home, and the events unfolded before his eyes. What was even more intriguing was that, although the grand jury never heard his testimony, Detective Cambra had spoken to him. The young man told him that on the day of Shirlene's death, she had asked Ken to stay with her because she wanted to die in peace. This indicated that indeed she had been contemplating death that day. However, the jury never heard this. Attorney John Edmonds returned to court with these new materials and won the case. The murder charge against his client was dropped. Ken Wakisaka was now not just released on bail, but fully free. However, he was not declared innocent. If he had been found innocent, according to the law, he could not have been tried again for the same crime. But as things stood, there remained a possibility of a retrial. Interestingly, there was another witness who knew both Cheryl and Ken. Marjorie Collier works as a manager of the apartment complex where the couple lived. Unlike Tiffany and Tammy, Marjorie knew for certain that it was Cheryl who was the instigator of all the arguments. Cheryl had once casually told Marjorie that Ken was her complete opposite. He never argued with her or raised his voice. In case of a disagreement, he would prefer to go outside for a walk to clear his mind. Cheryl didn't like that. On April 5th, when Tammy called an ambulance to their mother's house, Marjorie was also there at work. She spoke with the paramedics, who told her that Cheryl was conscious and fully aware of what was happening, enough to refuse to go with them. The paramedics' report noted that Ken had decided his wife didn't need to go to the hospital, but Marjorie was told by the paramedics that Cheryl had refused to go herself. Later, when Marjorie learned that Ken was accused of killing his wife, she couldn't believe it. She had her own version of what might have happened between the couple. Her assumptions were based on an incident that occurred when Cheryl came into her office. She was loud and insisted on being seen immediately. Marjorie had come to close the door since she hadn't started work yet. It was still early, but as she was closing the door, she accidentally hit Cheryl on the arm, causing her to spill a cup of coffee. Marjorie didn't think much of it until a police officer arrived and threatened her with arrest for assault. Cheryl had called the police. The woman claimed that the spilled coffee had burned her legs. But even the officer could see that one cup of coffee couldn't cause such severe burns on both of her legs, from her thighs to her feet. The only conclusion was that Cheryl had injured herself. She was willing to harm herself just to frame Marjorie. So Marjorie developed her own theory about how the woman had died. Of course, this is just her version, but she believes that Cheryl wanted to make it appear as though her husband had tried to kill her, but she went too far and ended up dying. However, of course, Cheryl's daughters could not be persuaded. They continued to demand a retrial, but the former prosecutor was no longer working in the office, and the new one was in no rush to move forward with the case. Confident that his client would again be accused of murder, attorney John Edmonds sought help from a well-known pathologist who firmly stated that Cheryl did not die from strangulation. The marks that were believed to be signs of strangulation were actually caused by the tubes that had been inserted into her mouth and had pressed against her throat during her 5 days in the hospital. In response, the new prosecutor hired other experts who, unexpectedly for him, confirmed that Cheryl had not been strangled. As a result, in 2010, the prosecutor's office announced that it was abandoning the strangulation theory, the very theory that had been used to charge Ken back in 2002. In an email to Cheryl's daughters dated January 22, 2014, the new prosecutor wrote that the district attorney had given the green light for Ken to be tried for murder resulting from criminal negligence. That is, they wanted to accuse him of failing to provide medical help to his wife, which ultimately led to her death. However, the case was never brought to trial. Attorney John Edmonds argues that this theory could be easily disproven, as Ken had indeed tried to help Cheryl by calling 911. There was also the issue of the pill bottle found under the bush near the couple's house. However, during the 2002 trial, Detective Canberra testified that on April 6th, after Cheryl was admitted to the hospital, he visited the couple's apartment in search of possible evidence, suggesting that the woman had intended to take her own life. Ken was at home and showed the detective a medicine cabinet which contained a white bottle with red pills. The detective did not seize it that day, but on April 8th, he was told that Tiffany and Tammy had found an empty bottle of medication under the bush. However, on April 6th, the detective had carefully examined that part of the yard and the bushes, and he was sure that no pill bottles had been there at the time. He was convinced that this was the same bottle he had seen on April 6th. This was intriguing, but in any case, the bottle contained anti-seizure medication, which Cheryl had been taking and which is sold without a prescription. However, a non-lethal amount of a completely different medication used to treat heart arrhythmias was found in her system. But even here, it would not be possible to prove that Ken was hiding something or trying to conceal evidence. On the contrary, when the paramedics arrived, he also showed them the medicine cabinet, where the medical staff counted the remaining pills in the bottle to determine how many she had taken. Moreover, the attorney could have proven that in the final days, Cheryl was emotionally unstable. Her doctor had prescribed her medication to help her cope with her emotional state and even wanted to admit her to a psychiatric clinic for treatment. Tiffany and Tammy were certain that within a couple of years the case would be brought back to court, but the years have continued to pass without any attempts to recharge Ken, and it remains unclear whether such attempts will ever be made. Meanwhile, the sisters continue to review all the case files in the hope of finding another clue. Their husbands and children often have to go without their wives and mothers, who are conducting their own investigation. But the women believe they cannot live peacefully without fulfilling the promise they made to their mother, a promise that has become an obsession, preventing them from veering off course.